This is E4, one of the campaign tracks in Trackmania Nations Esports World Cup, a Formula 1 racing game released in 2006. At a first glance, this track might not look particularly interesting, but for the last 14 years it's been home to the oldest world record in the game. Until now. The oldest Trackmania world record has just been broken, a legendary record that stood on top of the leaderboards uncontested for over 14 years. Usually when such old, fabled world records are beaten, the accomplishments are widely celebrated in gaming. The oldest Trackmania world record being beaten is something that should have been massive news, but very few people have even heard about it happening. So today in this video, I'll tell you the incredible story of the record that stood for 14 years and the long and difficult effort to beat it. Just before we begin, I've noticed that a lot of my viewers aren't subscribed, so if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, then please consider doing so. It really helps me out and it lets you know when new Trackmania content is coming out. Thanks. To start off, let's have a look at the map. E4 starts out with a big drop down, where you fall down to the ground, landing in a quarter pipe to preserve speed. It then continues with a right turn and some booster blocks, where the car rapidly gains speed before going up the hill and over anti-boosters, where the car rapidly loses speed. After that, you jump through the checkpoint, go down the hill, and build up a lot of speed with the boosters before going up the loop and into the finish. At a first glance, E4 is a fairly simple track, with only a few distinct parts where you can gain or lose significant amount of time. Which begs the question, just how could a record last 14 years on E4? And to answer that question, we'll have to go back all the way to 2006. In April of 2006, 3 months after the game was released, the world record on E4 was a 22.33 second run by Nero. Despite E4 being a fairly linear track, Nero already had some good strats to save time. On the first drop down, he released the acceleration mid-air, so that he could land as early as possible in the quarter pipe, temporarily losing him a bit of time, but gaining it back again and having excess speed over the following straight. Then, after jumping through the checkpoint, he slowed down so that he could maintain full grip on the downhill, getting a lot more speed for the ending. For its time, this was a very solid run by Nero, and the track already seemed close to optimized. But that's when things were about to change drastically. On the 3rd of June 2006, Victor started driving a run on E4 that would become legendary. On the first drop down, Victor didn't release the acceleration like Nero, and lost a significant amount of time. The following turn wasn't optimal either, and coming up towards the ending, he was over half a second behind Nero's world record. But here's the thing, Victor wasn't really trying to beat Nero. The reason Victor was playing E4 on this particular day was because he wanted to go on top of the stadium roof, and his idea was to use the loop on E4 as a launching ramp to get there. So Victor drove a casual run through the track, ready to jump on top of the roof, when this happened. That day, Victor never reached the stadium roof. When he went out of the loop, he missed and flew straight into the pole, and the redirection of his crash sent his car flying straight towards the finish. He then hit the finish line from underneath, and the run counted, effectively skipping the entire last loop and beating Nero's world record by almost a second. 21:37. This run is perhaps the single greatest happy little accident in Trackmania history. Victor had not even conceived of the idea that there might be a shortcut on the track. All he wanted to do was just explore the stadium roof, and because he missed and failed the jump to get there, he ended up with a world record instead. When people heard about Victor's new record, they were shocked, and rightfully so. Even Victor in his own words said, "I don't know what happened, but I'm very, very happy." But what had actually happened? A small developer oversight when creating the game had the finish line clipping slightly into the floor of the finish block, meaning that it could be crossed from underneath. A bug that would later be known as a bug finish. Now the race was on to be the next person to do it. Since the shortcut saved so much time, any completion would be good enough to land yourself in the top 10. And remembering that Victor's start wasn't the greatest, a completion could even be enough for a world record. The idea that one pole hit into bug finish was all that stood between you and your first Trackmania world record was an alluring one. And over the following days, many players tried to beat it, but no one succeeded. Players eventually realized that this wasn't just an ordinary luck-based shortcut, where given enough time and attempts, eventually you're gonna get a completion. This was different. To make matters worse, as you go down the booster hill, the game locks your car in the internal camera perspective, to help you with seeing where to go in the loop. But on the flip side, it makes seeing where you're flying to on the shortcut nearly impossible. All you could really do was flip out of the loop and hope for the best. And despite thousands of players trying exactly that, no one else managed to complete it. 2006 came and went, and the record would stand all the way through 2007 as well, with no contestants. In April of 2008, things would once again change, when Addio released their brand new game, Trackmania Nations Forever. A rework of Trackmania Nations ESWC with better graphics and also a better multiplayer. Nations Forever was an instant hit, and many ESWC players quickly shifted over to the new game. Both games would still have active player bases for the next little while, but eventually, Nations Forever established itself as the go-to Trackmania game, leaving ESWC in an awkward spot. As 2010 and 2011 came and went, there were just a handful of competitive players left in the game. The general consensus at the time was that Victor's record might stand forever. Most players had moved on from the game, and those that were still around didn't want to bother with such a lucky track. And as time went on, there was an ever-increasing problem for those that actually did want to try the track. Windows. You see, Trackmania Nations ESWC was released for the Windows XP operating system, and in order to prevent piracy, the game had a StarForce driver. The StarForce driver would spell disaster for ESWC, as with each new iteration of Windows, the driver would cause more and more errors, preventing players from launching the game. But in October of 2012, Windows 8 was released, and if you install the latest version of Windows, then ESWC would become impossible to access. The amount of players who had old enough computers running old enough operating systems to launch the game became ever fewer. But in 2015, there was a small resurgence in activity. A generational shift in Trackmania, where old players were quitting the game and new players were coming in. Many of the new players had heard the legendary tale of the accidental world record that was set on E4 and wanted to give the track a shot themselves, including me. In 2015, I myself started playing E4. I didn't have access to Trackmania Nations ESWC, so I was playing a remake of the track in Trackmania Nations Forever, TMN Race E4, where the shortcut still hadn't been done by anyone. Playing the track, I got to experience firsthand just how incredibly difficult the shortcut was. It felt impossible. But having said that, I knew that I could get the shortcut. I was getting more consistent and getting excruciatingly close attempts that were just a few pixels away from hitting the bug finish. I would keep playing TMN Race E4 on and off, amassing over 100 close bounce attempts towards the bug fin and over 200 hours of playtime, hoping to recreate the miracle that Victor had done all those years ago. And on one night in March of 2018, 2.5 years after I first started playing the track, I finally got this run. It had taken 12 years, but finally, the E4 shortcut had been done for a second time. Victor's record though would still stand unbeaten, as I drove my run in Trackmania Nations forever. In order to beat Victor's record, you'd have to have access to ESWC, and at this point, basically no one did. But 2 years later, in May of 2020, there was a spark of hope, when seemingly out of nowhere, the Russian YouTube channel Reactive CD uploaded this video to YouTube: how to run Trackmania ESWC on Windows 8 and Windows 10. In order to get the game to boot, Reactive CD had made his own patch for Star Force all by himself that was compatible with modern versions of Windows. And sure enough, when players downloaded the game and tried it, the patch worked. All of a sudden, Trackmania players had access to a goldmine of maps and leaderboards that had stood mostly untouched since 2012. A treasure trove had just been discovered that had been buried from the world for the past 8 years. In the days following the patch, many world records would immediately fall, as players' skill levels had risen much higher than what they were in the old days. But one record that still stood strong was E4. Victor's record at this point had stood for 14 years unbeaten, but now that having access to the game wasn't a problem anymore, who would actually be crazy enough to try to beat it? Well, that's where TMB comes in. TMB was also one of the players that had tried to shortcut TMN Race E4 all those years ago, and as soon as he caught wind of the new patch, he immediately downloaded the game and booted up the original track. Over the following weeks and months, TMB would get many close attempts, sometimes just barely missing the bug finish. He knew that he could get the record, and people were motivating him to push onwards. And then, on the 9th of August 2020, history was made, when after having stood as the world record for 14 years and 2 months, Victor's record was finally beaten. TMB had done it. 21:13, 24 hundredths of a second faster than Victor. Commenting about his run, TMB said that it took him over 150 hours of grinding to achieve it. But at last, Victor's immortal world record had finally been beaten. It is crazy to look back and think that this entire series of events would have never happened if Victor hadn't failed to jump up to the stadium 14 years ago. But alas, here we are, at the end of a decade-long effort to go just a few hundredths faster in a racing game. Because in Trackmania, just as with other things in life, it is in our nature to want to push the limits. And as a wise man once said, the difference between the impossible and the possible often lies in a man's determination. If you found this video interesting, then subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. And I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.